Hi there, I'm your host Marlene McConnell and welcome to the Surviving Trauma Stories of Hope podcast. In this week's episode, I am pleased and excited to welcome Rebecca Wellington from her home in Seattle, Washington, where she lives on the traditional homelands of the Duwamish people. Rebecca has taught high school social studies as well as undergraduate courses and graduate level courses in education history and curriculum and instruction. Her higher education teaching adventures have taken her to universities across Western Washington, including University of Washington, Seattle University, and the University of Puget Sound. She holds a doctorate in education history from the University of Washington, where she taught in the undergraduate program of the College of Education. Rebecca's career in education started on the ocean, sailing around the world on a traditionally rigged tall ship. Through this 2-year global circumnavigation, Rebecca trained for a U.S. Coast Guard captain's license and went on to work in a non-profit outdoor education, teaching kids to sail on the Charles River in Boston and later on the Puget Sound of Washington State. Rebecca's scholarly articles have been published in the History of Education Quarterly, the American Indian Quarterly, and the Pacific Northwest Quarterly. Rebecca was driven to write a history of adoption in the United States from a perspective of an adoptee and to honor the memory of her older sister and truth of brave women everywhere. Rebecca's proudest accomplishment is mothering her 2 beautiful daughters. It's been a pleasure to have Rebecca join me on the podcast, and I hope you will enjoy her different perspective on adoption. Thank you to my listeners for joining me on this journey. Please comment on the post on Instagram, LinkedIn, and Facebook and let me know what you think of this episode. Also head to Amazon.com, Takealot.com, and Audible to get your copy of my book, Ray of Light, and please leave me a rating and review. It would mean the world to me. Also, please check out my website and download your free journal prompt and relaxing meditation on the resources page. If you would like me to speak at your event, then please hit me up at hello@mycenteredlife.com. As always, stay tuned and keep listening. Hi, Rebecca. Welcome to the Surviving Trauma Stories of Hope podcast. It's so nice to have you here.
Thank you, Marlene. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to talk, share some stories.
Yeah, I'm excited to hear all about your upcoming book that is due to be released on April the 9th. This is so exciting, becoming a published author, and all of the other interesting topics that we're going to be discussing today, everything from motherhood to adoption and everything in between. So yeah, I'm excited about it.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So maybe I'll just kick it off and ask just to give us some background of your story, because the topic that you predominantly speak about is about adoption. And as an adoptee, what was that journey like for you?
So my backstory, I was adopted when I was 2 days old. My birth mother relinquished me at birth. And in the state of California, in the United States, in 1975. And there was a law at the time that said there had to be a 48-hour waiting period between relinquishment and when my adopting parents could pick me up. So I was born, and then I just sat in a hospital, nursery for 2 days. So I wasn't held. I mean, so there's some like birth trauma for me there that I never really processed. But then I grew up I was adopted into a family that had a lot of means. So I grew up in a lot of privilege with a lot of resources. And the story that I was always told.
Oh, I'm so happy.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's part of this.
I'm so happy about that.
That's part of the story is, I mean, to be really blunt, I mean, the folks, particularly historically, who were adopting were wealthy white families, right? And that's kind of the root of my messaging in the book, Who is a Worthy Mother, is, who there are a lot of societal pressures, and this is from a very American perspective, right? So I do sort of a deep dive on American history of the last 100+ years. But the way I have come to understand that adoption works is it's a project in which babies are taken through relinquishment by choice, by persuasion, by force, or literally stolen from mothers who are not deemed capable or worthy of mothering, and given to families and communities that are deemed worthy and capable of mothering. And in that is a very hegemonic perspective of who a worthy mother is. And that identity is predominantly in the United States, white, upper middle class women, right? So it is not unusual that I would be adopted into a wealthier family.
That is such an interesting point, Rebecca. That is so interesting because my first inclination was to just have this absolute joy for ending up in this family with your adoptive parents and really having a privileged life, a better life, which I'm sure, would have been the wish of your biological mom for you. But I've never actually sat down and thought about the recipients of the babies. And so it's an interesting point. So in your research, how did you sort of arrive at this notion of who is in fact a worthy mother?
Yeah. So I grew up and lived the majority of my life in that paradigm that you're sort of describing, where you think this is the narrative in the United States, right? The story, the narrative, the mirage of adoption in our history of adoption is that, yes, this poor, incompetent birth mother gives birth and provides a better life for their child, and it's wonderful. Wow, lucky. You're so lucky, right? So that is the narrative I grew up with. You're so lucky. You're so fortunate. And I am not saying I'm not fortunate and grateful. I am. So much was afforded to me. I have a doctorate. And I was able to get a doctorate with 2 small children because I could afford childcare.
Yeah.
Right. Because of the means.
PhD.
Yeah. So there are many doors that were open to me because of the resources of my adopting family. That is a fact. But I grew up thinking everything around it was good. It is a story of hope. It's a story of saving a child, right? And then 2 things happened to me that completely upended that mirage that I had been living in. The first thing was I gave birth to my 2 daughters. My first one was born in 2010. And my second daughter was born in 2011. So they're 12 and 14 years old now. And my 2 daughters.
That's Maria and
That's
Victoria.
Maria and Victoria. My 2 daughters are still to date the only 2 people I know who I am biologically related to. I have never met anybody else in my life who I am biologically related to. So as you can imagine, meeting them, giving birth to them, meeting them was incredibly profound. And the story that went hand in glove with that mirage of adoption is wonderful, I'm so lucky, was that my birth mother was incapable of raising me, wanted to give me away, gave birth to me in a huge hospital in California, and walked out the door and went on to live her life. And that was wonderful. And, it all worked out, happy ending. And then I gave birth to my daughters, and I knew that was just not true. Any relinquishment of a baby is just seeped in trauma. And the context that brought her to the place where she carried me for 10 months and then gave birth to me, didn't hold me, and walked out of a hospital, that is a traumatic thing. Nobody gets to that point without being in crisis. So I gave birth to my daughters, and it just brought me to my knees. And I realized, okay, first of all, that was a lie to say that was a positive, wonderful experience for her, and there was no trauma involved in the relinquishment of a child that you've carried for 10 months. And then 5 years after my second daughter was born, my sister, my older sister, who was also adopted and who gave a child up for adoption when she was in her early 20s, she died of a drug overdose. And that was kind of like the thing that just pushed me over the edge. And I was like, I need to get the real story, because the story I've been living in my whole life, it's just, there's so many holes in it that it's like the house of cards is falling. And so I went to my parents and I said, I want to get as much information as I can about my birth community, where I came from, who are my people, who are my ancestors, and literally we had just put my sister in the ground, right? So when you lose somebody you love, and she was in her early 40s, she was way too young to be dying. And she died a horrible death of a drug overdose. When you put somebody in the ground, you realize, wow, life is really short. And that's when I was like, I need to go on this journey of finding out my real past. So I went to my parents and I started asking, what do you have? How can I find these roots and threads? And they basically were like, we have nothing. And the one thing they gave me was a copy of my birth certificate, a digital copy of my birth certificate. And their names are listed on the birth certificate as my mother and father. And I come to find out that was a falsified birth certificate that was created 4 months after I was born. So the name of the person who gave birth to me had been erased from my birth, right? And in her place were my adopting parents, their names. So it was a falsified record. And I was like, that's really problematic. Like, why do I not have access to my original records? And I met with an attorney here in Seattle who specializes in birth records and adoption. And she basically said it's going to be impossible for you to get access to your original birth records because they've been sealed by the state. So I'm just like hitting walls everywhere I go. And I'm like, how do I get over these hurdles? And
it's, I imagine it's so demotivating every time when you think, okay, let me try this, and just hitting all these hurdles and walls.
Yeah. And I had just finished my doctorate in education history, and I knew the one thing I knew how to do was to do research. So I was like, okay, I'm going to get some answers. And I just started reading everything I could about adoption policy, and adoption history, because I love history. I teach history. Yes. And that's what I was looking for, was my history. I wanted my history. So I'm like, if I can get the bigger backstory, that could maybe give me some answers. And it was just, Marlene, the history is horrifying. It is the exact opposite of that story, right? Your first response when I started sharing my story, you're like, oh, you're so lucky. Wonderful. Like, it was a nightmare.
That's how we view
adoption. And I just was, like physically ill reading the history of adoption in the United States and transnationally, right? The funnel of bringing babies in from different spaces around the world to Americanize them. And it just blew my mind. And so I started writing it down because it started to answer all these questions that I had had. Why, first of all, why is my birth certificate falsified? Why have I always felt so much shame around being adopted that I didn't even talk about it, right? Why did I work so hard to assimilate into my family and yet never feel part of my family? And so I that's how this book was born. Part. Yeah. And it was grief writing. I was working with a grief counselor, a therapist, dealing with my sister's death. and doing a lot of personal
Right.
writing. And then I'm writing this history, and the two kind of came together. And that's how this book was
Mm-hmm.
born. So that's the
Wow.
story, the
And
etymology of the book.
yeah, but it's so interesting because you never almost think that these worlds sort of collide. When you think of grief, you think of motherhood, you think of fertility, and you think of adoption. You you know you can't really imagine that grief and fertility and adoption sort of can be intricately linked. But yet, that's exactly what you found.
Well, that is like, how can adoption and fertility not be deeply interwoven? Like, if you think about it, adoption is taking a baby from one community, one family, one person, and putting it, a family that has a woman who has been fertile, and putting it in a family predominantly that has struggled with fertility. And it's a transaction of moving one baby from one person to another. And one of the claims I make is what that exposes as is how our nation differentially values women for their ability to mother, and also differentially values and assesses women's fertility. There are women who are shamed for being too fertile in the United States, and there are women who are shamed for not being fertile enough. And the baby gets moved from one to the other.
I see that. And would you say sort of that is a way that we could think of motherhood? Because you either have your own very many and it's attached to shame, or you have this transaction that perhaps also is attached to shame.
Yes, I think shame is at the root of all parties in the transaction triad, you know. Yeah, there's a shame in having what also just that our society has this term illegitimate, right? That you have this illegitimate baby. What makes it illegitimate, right? That you're not married, or that you're the wrong race, or that you're in the wrong socioeconomic space, right? Or that you're the wrong, citizen or not a citizen. I mean, these were all the identity components that facilitated practices historically in the United States of literally taking, and I'm not exaggerating, literally stealing babies from birth communities, stealing them, or coercively, viciously, coercively telling women that they have to give their babies up. And then the flip side within these projects was the forcing of women to be sterilized, right? So it's like fertility sits at the root of all of it.
But then that conversation sort of takes on a whole new meaning, because if you're forcibly doing this, getting a woman pregnant and then forcing them to give up these babies, I mean, that sounds to me like a sinister and illegal practice. Is that what you found when you were doing the research?
Yeah. Well, I didn't find anybody being forced to become pregnant. I do think, I mean, honestly, there are many women who have been put into this space of forced, being forced or coerced to relinquish their babies, young women who've been raped. Like that has happened. But I think in a lot of cases, it's women were not forced to become pregnant. But there is a trend historically of, if a woman is then pregnant, whether she was raped or not, and she is not in a space where she has access to resources and community support from various institutions like social workers and legal systems who decide you should not raise this child, you don't have the resources, you're not deemed worthy. Yeah, there are just so many horrifying practices historically of women being told they have to give up their baby. Yeah, it is horrible. And I think the most recent wave of it that is hugely unethical and that is getting some more press is the industry of transnational adoption in the 1990s, 1980s, especially 1990s, early 2000s in the United States, where children have been coming over, babies being brought over from all parts of the world to be adopted into families in the United States. And the backstory of their births are, it's child trafficking in many cases.
If we talk about the adoption, either locally in America or from another country, like you've just explained, what are some of the policies around this? Because I would imagine that there are very strict rules and policies around adoption, specifically whether it's in America, in the United States, or whether you're adopting from another country. What did your research bring up as it relates to adoption policies?
So this is where I get a little out of my wheelhouse because I'm not an expert on what is happening now. And what I do know is now, at this point, the rate of transnational adoptions has gone way down. So it's like a third of what it was even a decade ago. And a large part of that is there's been a lot of work done by different organizations around the world to have better oversight of where children are coming from. And there's a researcher, David Smolin, who's, I think, at the University of Alabama, who's a legal scholar who has done a lot of work on monitoring child trafficking. And then he has testified in The Hague and other international tribunals, and brought a lot of stories to light. And he really started that work because in the early 1990s, he and his wife adopted 2 girls from India, and he's an American, and through an agency. And this is where it's very difficult to regulate, country to country, because different countries and different states and different provinces have different rules. And so as you cross borders, it just becomes a lot more challenging. And the impetus for his work that's ongoing was he and his wife adopted 2 girls who were actually, I think around the age of my daughters. So they're 11 or 12 years old, from India. And the girls did not speak English when they came over, and they were just absolutely emotionally distraught. And he was able to find a translator. And within, I believe, within the first week of them arriving, they found out that they had been taken. So their mother who was experiencing real extreme poverty, had been given an opportunity to put her girls in a boarding school to get education. And then they were taken from the school and sold, right? And through different parties sold,
right?
And they were adopted by this family in the United States. And as many people, individuals, and elements are involved in those transactions and money is changing hands, it becomes difficult to know and trace, sort of, And so this American family, the Smolins, worked with what they thought was a reputable adoption organization. They paid money, right? And on average, families are paying about $50,000 US. It's a lot of money, right? And that, I think, the people who are doing sort of investigative work at this point into sort of uncovering where there could be some child trafficking in these international adoption organizations, the root of it is to see where the money is going, right? And one of the claims I've made historically is there's always been money changed hands through adoption. My parents paid for me. It is a transaction. It's the commodification of a baby, right? Again, from one community that isn't supported in keeping that baby to a community that is deemed, and that's where money is a huge part of it, right? You were like, oh, you got adopted by a wealthy family. Well, yeah, they had to be really wealthy in order to pay. I was adopted through a private agency, through a private attorney. I mean, that's a lot of money. But one thing I do know is that money didn't go back to my birth community, right? It's like, who gets the money in the transaction, right? That's what I think is the work that needs to be done, is following the money. Yeah.
And where do the kids? I mean, if I think about this family that you were speaking about, where the mother had relinquished her rights or thought that she was sending her daughters to a boarding house,
Or it was a school. They were at a school. It was a boarding school.
For a school,
yeah.
Right? And then they were taken from the school. What about the ones who don't end up sort of in the system with adoptive parents that can afford to pay that money and take them, so I guess that sort of touches more on the darker side of what happens when you're not adopted, but you could be trafficked.
Yes.
And that's the sinister part of trafficking humans, is effectively.
Yeah. And one of the arguments made with people who are trying to change policy so that there isn't these really sinister systems that are happening that are abusive to many different communities, is that if the money is going to go somewhere, I mean, if money is going to go somewhere, it should go back to that community so that they can support and raise the child, right? It seems like a pretty horrific solution to say, and this has been a trend historically in the United States, is to target communities that are experiencing trauma and communities that don't have access to resources, and communities that are experiencing extreme poverty. And one really powerful example of that in the United States are Native American communities. And one historical narrative I share in the book is, in the 1950s and 1960s, the US government funded a program called the Indian Adoption Program. And this program came out of government concern for the really intense poverty that was prolific in reservation communities. So Native American reservation communities around the United States. And there was really high levels of addiction and really high levels of infant mortality.
Right.
And that was caused by years and years of just horrifically abusive policies put on Native communities, right? For the last 200 years in US history. And so this new strategy through the Indian Adoption Project was, well, one way we will cure this community and save them and deal with poverty in these spaces is to take their children away. They are not capable of raising their children because they are in crisis. And so there was a pattern of really abusive, coercive, forced relinquishment of children. So social workers, police, doctors would come into reservation homes and literally take young children and babies from families that were identified as incapable of parenting because they were living in crisis. And the babies and the children were shipped hundreds of miles away, and they all went to non-native white families. So
and that society,
this
really,
idea,
and government failing those communities is effectively.
Absolutely. And what dovetailed on the tail end of the Indian Adoption Project, the following several years, was a pervasive campaign of forcibly sterilizing Indigenous women. Hundreds and hundreds of women were sterilized, and they were directly lied to by doctors and nurses, told that they could have their uteruses reimplanted. They were told they were having just other procedures done, and they were in fact being sterilized. And it was just this really racist and horrific mentality that the way you fix the problems in that community is you stop them from having children and you take away their children.
Wow. That speaks to the social and the racial biases that I guess is just so deeply embedded in the 1960s in the way that government operated and the interactions with government and society. That is absolutely shocking. You mentioned on how this is like a forceful sterilization that was happening at the time, and I was wondering. It actually made me think of a talk that I did a few years ago, just before actually the American elections in America. In fact, no, it wasn't in America; it was in Jamaica, but it was ahead of the elections in the United States, and one of the main topics at the conference where I was the Roe versus Wade judgment. And that was sort of a topic that was a topic of discussion at that time. So, and that obviously has to do with abortion, but also, a way of regulating an individual's body. So listening to what you've said now about what happened in the 1960s, do you think that Roe versus Wade and the way that it is presented now after it had been overturned is sort of a repetition of that in just another form?
Yeah. So in the book, I do talk about the Dobbs decision, Dobbs versus Women's Health Organization, Jackson Women's Health Organization, which is the case that overturned Roe versus Wade in 2022. And in that decision, two of our Supreme Court justices, Justice Amy Coney Barrett and Justice Samuel Alito, in their decisions supporting the Dobbs ruling, both referenced adoption as a solution to the abolishment of abortions. Right. And Alito actually said there is a increased demand for adoptable babies right now in the United States. And with the nullification of abortion access, reproductive rights, we can reignite the supply of adoptable babies. He cited that in his footnotes in his decision. So yes, there is that is my concern as we move in the United States, as we are watching, right? The state of Florida just yesterday passed, I think, a 5-week abortion ban. I didn't even know I was pregnant at 5 weeks. Like, that's ridiculous. My concern, I am absolutely certain it will impact adoption projects in the United States moving forward. And I am deeply concerned about the health and welfare and well-being of women who don't have access to reproductive rights and who don't have access to resources, social services, financial support, community support, if and when they do become pregnant. I do believe that we will see some shifts and changes in adoption. And my concern is that we will see a trend of increased forced relinquishment. We'll go back to that space of women being forcibly, unethically encouraged to give their babies up because they don't have the choice or the autonomy to say, I do want to be a mother or I don't want to be a mother.
Right. And Rebecca, you've uncovered so much in your research and you've unpacked this in your book, but is there sort of a proposal for resolution to this issue that you think may help when it comes to policy reform or adoption in general?
Yeah, that's a great question. Because in my book, I really keep it historical. And that was the one feedback I got. People are like, well, what do we do now? Right. So the first thing is women need to have access to reproductive autonomy. Absolutely. I think it's absolutely essential. And our country right now is going in the exact opposite direction, which terrifies me. And so we all have to vote and we have to advocate for rights for women to have access to reproductive health care and resources so that women can autonomously choose whether they want to be mothers or not. That is your right to make that choice, right? And then I think the next step, and I've had the privilege of working with some really amazing activists and writers in this field of changing how adoption practices happen. I want to cite an amazing book, an author who I'm going to be speaking with at a book talk in a couple weeks, Sarah Easterly, and her colleagues wrote this incredible book called Adoption Unfiltered. It just published a couple months ago, and they bring together a birth mother, so a woman who has given a child up for adoption, and she works in adoption policy on the state and federal level, and then an adopting mother.
Oh, wow.
And then Sarah Easterly, who is the third author who I've been working with, she is an adoptee. And they are really connected with things that are happening policy-wide right now, and then also advocacy work within adoption organizations. So organizations in the United States that are helping families navigate adoption. And the work they're doing is really inspiring. And I think the heart of it is that every party in the adoption needs to have a voice and have choice and have support. And it has to be done without secrets, right? That child has the right to know where they came from. There needs to be open communication and connection between the adopting family and the birth community. And that is absolutely essential. And it cannot be saturated in lies and secrets. So historically, the policies demanded that there was a very big segregation between the adopting family and the birth community. And the response, I think, policy-wise, is to bring those two close together.
Yeah. I think it's also important for the adoptee. I mean, I can imagine that it might be transactional for, the adoptive community versus the birth community. So that there might be a disconnect there or a tension because obviously there's one that's giving and there's one that is now taking. But I think that a policy change, for more open communication and more documentation surrounding the adoption, is crucial for I would say, the well-being of the adoptee. So that, if you ever had to get to that place where you say, like you've described in your life, through various experiences, you felt like you wanted to know more about the birth community, that there is something available, because it is quite traumatic to reach that point and then to be left out in the cold with absolutely no information and just simply never knowing that part of your history. And so I agree that, I would also advocate for more transparency and documentation and openness and more communication.
Yeah.
And I'm glad that your book really, and through the work that you do, that you actually supporting, these positive policy changes, even through organizations that you're engaging with, because the truth is every voice matters, and your voice matters because you're essentially amplifying the voices of those that are marginalized, like the girls from India that you've described earlier, right? And you're exposing these racist and social biases that exist
Yes.
within the adoption community. And I think that, there needs to be more conversations like this. So yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Well, I want to add,
yeah,
Marlene, I think that's a third piece of it is we have to have difficult conversations about
absolutely.
this. And we have to, the only way to move forward and to create policy and systems that are supportive so that all parts of an adoption transaction, all members can walk through that space and feel heard and seen and loved and supported. In order to get to that place, we have to acknowledge the past, and we have to see all the missteps that we have made and the impacts that the really destructive policies have had, so that we can learn from that, so that we don't fall into a space of doing that again and repeating
Yeah.
it. Especially at this moment when women are pervasively losing access to reproductive rights, and we're looking towards a future where there can be, I'm concerned we're going to go back to that place of really abusive practices. So we have to be aware so that we don't repeat those practices. And that means having difficult conversations.
But that is also what your book speaks to. I think that your book, Who is a Worthy Mother? An Intimate History of Adoption, so beautifully goes and finds the research that documents that history in order for it to be in one place. So it can be easily referenced when faced with new policies, faced with new circumstances. And we can quickly see, where is the history repeating itself,
Yeah. And where are the missteps and how do we want to do it differently this next time?
Exactly.
As we're staring at this future that's uncertain.
Exactly. So earlier in our conversation, you spoke about your two girls and you gave birth to them. So as an adoptee, how do you think that the process of being adopted and being socialized in a different environment sort of affects the way that you engage with your children? And I'm specifically thinking about, you mentioned earlier that they are really the only biological relatives that you have. So how do you care for them?
Yeah. It's like when you have a privilege, a privilege of eyesight, we'll just say, right? Our eyes work, which is a huge privilege, right? To be able to see. You take it for granted. Every day we take it for granted, like these incredible things that we see. And when you don't have that, it's such a profound different world. And I have lived my whole life in my world not being with people who I have that connection with. And so when my daughters were born and I saw these little things that you, I don't, are you adopted, Marlene?
No, I'm not adopted.
So you grew up in a family where you saw these little things, the way your parents did something, the way they ate or looked, or just that comfort it's such a privilege. And it's, if you have lived with it your whole life, you do take it for granted because you that's all you know. I grew up not knowing it. And so when my daughters are born and I saw myself in them, little things like with their bodies, the way their bodies look, and the way, like, my daughter will twist her hair when she's nervous, or the way they look, or when they get angry, the facial expressions they make. I mean, it's just it was stunning to me. It was overwhelming.
Wow.
And I never get tired of it. And like, I will tell you, Marlene, writing this book has been one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. Processing my sister's death is perhaps the hardest thing I've ever had to go through. And then writing this book and uncovering this history has just been brutal. But I can do it because I have my daughters and my husband, who's an incredibly supportive person. But to have those anchors, like I described them in the book as my two anchors.
Yeah.
I mean, it was really healing for me. It was healing for me to give birth to them and to see them and to raise them in a way that my birth mother didn't get to do with me, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like
Yeah.
it's my way of coming full circle, and it's what's enabled me to move on this path, is having them.
Mm-hmm.
Really.
Yeah.
Not to put too much pressure on them, because they're their own people and they're amazing, and I try not to freak them out too much, but they have healed me, really.
Yeah. Yeah. I was going to ask you, so what does life look like now? But you've described it actually so beautifully. And I'm so happy for you that you have found this process and the raising of your children and all of these things that have happened, even though some of them were sad, like the passing of your sister, but that these all were, I guess, in some way necessary to bring you to this place where now you're effectively, through your own experience and the processing of that experience, able to help others. And
I think that's the power of trauma.
Yeah.
Is it's a great teacher.
Absolutely, it is. If you're willing to accept it, if you're willing to say, okay, this has happened, it's really difficult, but I want to do something with it, and I'm happy that you had this ability to transmute this experience that was so traumatic on different levels in your life and throughout different relationships, and really to turn it into something beautiful and so incredible, something that you can really, really, really be proud of, Rebecca.
Thank you so much, Marlene. I was able to write it because of my daughters, and I wrote it for my sister because she can't tell her story anymore.
Yeah.
So that was my other catalyst, was it's for her. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Is there anything in particular that you feel inspired? I mean, I know we've spoken so much about the book, and your book is out on April the 9th, and we're all excited. But is there anything specific that you feel inspired just to share with the listeners about your book?
Well, just one thing I've really realized in writing this book is the power of storytelling. And I think we're at this time, around the world, where I feel like it's really important for women, particularly, to tell their stories and for their voices to be heard. It's really life-changing to hear stories and to realize that we have all been through struggles, right? And if we share them, Mike, which is what your podcast is doing. I just love this era of podcasting. I think it's going to save us. This platform that people can talk and listen to each other. Like, that's what we need right now. So I just encourage other people, other women, other mothers and daughters to share their stories too. We need those stories.
And I think, even if you don't share it out on the big stage or out on a podcast, but, even just in your home.
Yeah.
Share it with your best friend.
Yeah.
Share it with your grandma, Tell your story to your grandpa. Yeah.
Yeah, that is so important, because the real sickness in this history that I've uncovered in the book is the secrets. The secrets are when people don't share, then that's what's so toxic. So sharing the stories, sharing those family stories and listening to each other is so important in any way, right? It doesn't have to be on a podcast. It can just be around the kitchen table.
Yes. Well, Rebecca, it's been so awesome having you here. I've enjoyed this conversation so much. You've given me so
Oh, well,
much food
thank
for
you.
thought. You've given me different perspective from the get-go, from the time we jumped into our episode. You've just given me a completely different perspective on adoption and adoption policy, and the history was for me completely educational because there was so much to learn, and which I obviously, I was never quite exposed to. So thank you so much for sharing all of this with us. And I want to wish you well with the work that you do and the success of your book. And may your book find all of the people in the world that it's meant to connect to.
Thank you so much, Marlene.
I'm going to link all of your links in the show notes, so the listeners can then just follow along on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. And I will also link your Amazon, because I assume your book will be out on Amazon. So I will also just link Amazon when the book is out on the 9th, because this episode will air shortly thereafter, so that the listeners can then also just go ahead and get themselves a copy of your book and leave you a rating and review.
Yay, I love it. Thank you. You know how this works.
Well, thank you so much for joining me once again. Take care.
All right. Thank you, Marlene.
Bye. That wraps up this podcast episode. Thank you for listening. If you enjoy my podcast, please take a minute to give me a rating and review in Apple Podcasts. Please subscribe in your favorite podcast directory so you don't miss an episode. Please consider following My Centered Life on Facebook and Instagram for daily inspiration. Thank you so much for spending this time with me. You can catch me again in the next episode. Same time, same place. Sending you lots of love and light.